bliss it was to be alive, to be young, to be interested in Australian politics in the late 60s and early 70s. Gough Whitlam made that an inspiring time. He showed my generation, I was at school and university while he beat some sense into the Labour Party, that politics could work, that it could be a force for social progress. I remember vividly December 1972, when the first act of the Whitlam government, which was essentially Gough Whitlam, was to bring the troops back from the squalid war in Vietnam, and his second act was to lift the sales tax on the contraceptive pill. He really dragged Australia into the 60s in 1972. After all those long, lickspittle years of Liberal governance, it was Gough Whitlam who led a social reform of enormous penetration. You'll hear, I'm sure, today, Bill Shorten has just been enumerating what the Whitlam government did in, I suppose, the essential trade, the essential purpose of politics, to make people happy. He made us happier more quickly than we would have been happy otherwise through the divorce laws. You had to prove a matrimonial crime before you could get divorced in the 60s. He abolished the death penalty, he brought in Medicare. His Race Relations Act was, in fact, the stepping stone years later to Mabo, made Mabo possible. His equality laws put women where they belonged equally in the workplace. Freedom of Information Act enabled Australians to see what the government was doing in their name. Of course, not all they saw was good. Bill Shorten has just said, Gough loved the Labour Party and the Labour Party loved Gough. No, they didn't, not all of them. He was betrayed by a number of buffhead ministers. Their names all began with C, interestingly enough, 4 of them. And his government was swept away. But its amazing social reform will not be forgotten. The Whitlam years, so few of them, were nonetheless perhaps the most inspiring years in the history of Australian politics. He spoke, I've had the privilege of speaking here 5 times. Gough spoke at this club 18 times in his political life. And while his passing may, in some respects, be easing the family, it is a great and important moment to take stock and remember that amazing period of reform in Australian history. I want to go back even further. I want to start with August the 22nd, 1939, in Salzburg, where Adolf Hitler had a villa, and he summoned his generals, who were all on the borders of Poland about to invade, and he made, even by his standards, a shocking and brutal speech, telling them not to be concerned about killing local women and children in Poland when they were invading. Many of them, half of them were Jews. There would be no retribution, he said, because, and I quote, after all, who now remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? The Blitzkrieg crimes and the annihilation of the Jews and the Roma peoples and other minorities were committed by Nazis who believed that they would have the same impunity allowed to those who oversaw, back in 1915, the extermination of over half the Armenian race by rounding up the men and putting them in labor battalions and killing them, by sending on death marches their women, old men, and children, marches into the Syrian desert where they knew that the majority, hundreds of thousands, would die. They may not, the Ottoman Turks, have used gas ovens, but they used death squads and starvation and typhus and concentration camps in places that we've only heard of today because they're currently being overrun by ISIS. Aleppo, Dezor, and so forth. And they used them to destroy Armenians, partly because they were Christians. Many of them were killed to cries of Allah Akbar, God is great. But they passed the laws to seize their homes and lands and churches because they were of a different, disliked because they were seen as making money and providing professionals more intelligent, because they were seen as a different and inferior race. And they then passed laws later in 1915 to expropriate all their property. They called it, in one of the great euphemisms of genocide, they called it abandoned, the law of abandoned properties. But of course, they were laws that seized their goods because they knew that they weren't coming back. There is an interesting historical link between the Armenian genocide and Australia, which has largely gone unnoticed. There are two. I'll mention the second one later. But the first is the fact that it began, as a lot of genocides do, with the arrest and murder of the intelligentsia of the doomed race. Scholars, writers, community leaders, teachers, and they were rounded up in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, on the 24th of April, 1915, the night before the dawn landing at Gallipoli. And that was no coincidence, as the Turkish army and its German leaders, actually, were preparing to repulse the Gallipoli, the Anzacs at the Gallipoli landing. They took the opportunity to begin the physical extermination of those they called the enemy within, a racial group of 2 million people, mainly in Anatolia in eastern Turkey, who'd lived there since the birth of Christ, and actually were the first people, other than the Jewish tribes, to convert to Christianity. In 301, they converted, the first Christians, 100 years before before the Roman Empire turned to Christianity. So by this time, they were, as I've explained, a despised minority in the caliphate, because it was a caliphate run by the Sultan, the so-called sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. So the Gallipoli landing was used as the excuse to begin a genocide which took 1 million civilian lives, some estimates 1.5 million, some a bit less. But over half, on any view, the number of Armenians who were there. So what, I ask in the book, do we owe to their lives, people who were butchered and starved as the result of internal state planning within a world war, which the Ottoman Empire had opportunistically entered on the side of Germany? I say opportunistically because the only reason they were entered on the side of Germany was they thought Germany would win and they would get more land. Well, the Armenians weren't killed in that war, they were killed under cover of that war. So I compare their deaths with that of some of my relatives who died there. I had a grand-uncle, William Piper Bill Robertson. He played the bagpipes in the Leichhardt Town Band, and he was huddling in the ships on the 24th, and he was one of the first to be killed by the Turkish gunfire on the 25th in Sniper's Alley. But he'd volunteered to fight. He was killed lawfully by Turkish soldiers. 100 years later, I don't think he's owed any special mourning other than a generalized sadness at the futility of that war and the failure of political leaders, stupid and stiff-necked, who took their nations to it and then refused to talk about peace for the next 4 years. But the million or so Armenians who died as the result of massacres and deportations were the victims, on any view, of a crime against humanity, and certainly on my view of genocide. And I think they should be remembered not merely as victims of war, like Piper Bill and the other 6,000 Anzacs. I believe they have a special claim on our memory and on our thinking about how to avoid such atrocities now and in the future, because they have never been requited. They have never, the crime, despite the promises of the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, in 1915 called this a crime against humanity and promised that the perpetrators would be punished. Those promises went for nothing. Well, they went for the Treaty of Sevres, which set up a court to punish the Turkish perpetrators, but then along came Ataturk, along came oil, gas, exactly the sort of things that the great powers then wanted, and the Treaty of Sevres was torn up, and no one was punished, with an exception that I'll deal with. There is today a raging international debate about whether the massacres and deportations amount to genocide in law. Turkey denies it and insists that all the Armenian deaths, they admit there were at least 600, they say there were only 600,000. Can you imagine? Only 600,000? What sort of perverted logic says that only 600,000? They say there were 1.1 million Armenians. The church records show there were 2.1 million. But 600,000 out of 1.1 million, that's more than half the race. So even on Turkey's own admission, that was the death toll. But they say the Young Turk government, which was in power at the time, was justified in killing those people because of military necessity. And we'll come to that in a minute. But most democracies in Europe have recognized the genocide, and some have made it a crime to deny it. The debate has touched Australia when the Speaker of the Turkish Parliament heard that New South Wales Parliament had recognized the genocide. He issued a threat that no New South Wales politician would be allowed to attend the ceremony at Gallipoli next April. Well, maybe it was this fear that caused Julie Bishop in June to write to a group of Australian Turks, I quote, "We," that is the federal government, "do not recognize these events as genocide." That's what she said. And she went on, "The approach of the Australian government has been not to become involved in this sensitive debate." Well, the surest far way of becoming involved is to declare that the Australian government does not recognize these events as genocide. That is what the debate is all about. Now, perhaps Sarah Baker called her foolish in the book. I think probably the draftsperson of the letter was foolish, and really they meant to say that the Australian government expresses no opinion either way. But that's not what she wrote. And her statement was reported throughout Turkey in banner headlines. Australian foreign minister says Armenians not victims of genocide. Australia, there was no Armenian genocide. That's how her statement was reported. So Julie Bishop would become a genocide denier, liable to arrest in countries like Switzerland and France, were she to travel there. And this is all very surprising, because in opposition, Tony Abbott would issue a statement every year on the 24th of April condemning what he termed, in quotes, the Armenian genocide, until he became Prime Minister and no doubt wanted to attend the centenary in Gallipoli next year. But it's not all that surprising. Tony Abbott has followed in the footsteps of Barack Obama, who proclaimed during his presidential campaign in 2008, I quote, "The Armenian genocide is a widely documented fact, supported by an overwhelming body of historical evidence. The facts are undeniable. As president, I will recognize the Armenian genocide." But he reneged. Since becoming president, he hasn't mentioned it. He's dropped all use of the G word, and he refers each year on the 24th of April to Medz-Jürgen, which is an Armenian word meaning the great calamity, but of course a word that means nothing to Americans. He does call it one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. He says 1.5 million Armenians were brutally massacred, but he goes on to say, elliptically, quote, "I've already said what my opinion is on what happened in 1915, and it hasn't changed." Now, what did he say his opinion was? Well, you have to Google it back to 2008, and you then find his opinion that it was genocide. But he dare not say that. Why? Because Turkey will go ballistic, because it will deny him use of the spy bases in Turkey. It will deny Americans the airports that they're using for their attacks on ISIS. So Turkey is simply too inconvenient to tell the truth. And that's the case in Britain as well. When I first studied, I should say that 43 of the 50 American states have recognized the Armenian genocide, so have France, Germany, all the major European countries except Britain. Scotland, the Scottish Parliament has recognized it, the Welsh Parliament has recognized it, but the UK avoids referring to this inconvenient truth. And I first became interested in the issue a few years ago when some Armenians group came to me and said, why is Britain using this strange formula? They were saying, oh, the evidence was not sufficiently unequivocal to say that it was genocide. And I did some searching under the Freedom of Information Act and discovered this wonderful memo that explained it all. It said, Turkey is neuralgic on this subject. Our position is unethical, but given the importance of the strategic, political, and commercial relations with Turkey, it would be inconvenient to acknowledge the genocide. And so my book is called The Inconvenient Genocide, and talks of the genocide equivocation of the leaders of the UK and the US as we come up to this centenary of Anzac Day, centenary of the genocide. And in my book, I try to settle the issue. There are hundreds of books by historians who may be very eminent, but they don't know the law. And I've tried to apply the law as a former UN judge to the facts that are generally agreed. And my conclusion is, beyond any doubt, that the Armenian people were victims in 1915 of what is today referred to as genocide, defined by the Genocide Convention of 1948. I'm not going to weary you by describing in any detail, particularly at lunchtime, the massacres, the Euphrates River so swollen with dead bodies that it changed its course, the beheading of boys, the selling into sexual slavery of girls, the forced conversion of so many people to Islam as a way of saving their lives. The Armenians in the Ottoman Empire had always been denied civil rights. In the 1890s, there were the Hamidian massacres of 200,000 were killed, showing the Turkish government that there was this racially inflammatory situation. The Young Turks took power in 1909, and they started a Turkification program which stressed the racial superiority of Turks over the disliked and demeaned Armenians, who were disliked as the Jews were because they made money, because they were intelligent, they had their own Christian schools, and they were in the professions and made money out of the professions. They started this program. Again, we can see patterns of genocide. This is why the study of genocide is so important, the demeaning, the use of language, tubercular microbes on the body politic, the same language used in Rwanda, where the Tutsis were called cockroaches. They changed the names of all the towns and streets that had Christian names. They were changed to Muslim names. They banned the use of Armenian. The very word Armenian couldn't be used for companies and associations, and they didn't teach its language. When they entered the war, as I say, quite opportunistically on the side of the Germans, it was a caliphate, and they had a top imam, and they got him to declare jihad against all Christians, but he had to accept Germans and Austro-Hungarians because they were on the same side. It was a difficult fatwa to pronounce. And then in April 1915, as I've said, came the roundup of intellectuals, the placing of the men in the labor battalions for massacre, the deportations that caused them all. And this is also interesting, I think, in the study of genocide. The use of euphemism is fascinating. In the Nazi Holocaust was planned at the Wannsee Conference, notes taken by Adolf Eichmann, and they talk about evacuation of the Jews to the east. The Turks talked about relocation of the Armenians to the Syrian desert. Well, both, of course, were euphemisms for killing, in the one case by the gas ovens, in the other by starvation, sending them to walk hundreds of miles in the desert with little food, with a lot of marauders, and then with typhus and dysentery in the concentration camps at the end of the line, and then passing the law that expropriated all their property, all the property that they'd left, because they weren't coming home. So it's interesting to compare those, the use that euphemism plays in the transporting of people to death. Evidence of the government's genocidal intention comes from many sources, most compellingly from their own allies, the German consuls and ambassadors, who were appalled and who reported to Berlin, these people are exterminating the Armenians. They were terrified that Germany would become complicit in what the British and French and Russian ministers had denounced as a crime against humanity. And they were urging Bethmann Hollweg and the Kaiser to take some action. But they refused, and Bethmann Hollweg actually said, "It's unheard of to criticize your ally in the middle of a war." So the Germans remained silent and complicit. But their missionaries didn't, and from the work of German missionaries we get some of the most vivid descriptions. And of course the Americans, who were neutrals at the time in 1915, had direct conversations with Talat Pasha, who was the the prime mover in the genocide. And he said to him, "We're solving the Armenian problem by eliminating the Armenians." He was quite upfront to Morgenthau, the American ambassador. And there is telling evidence from Austrian and Italian diplomats, from German and American missionaries, and from Australians. It's extraordinary. In the War Memorial in Canberra, there are letters home and reminiscences after release by a number of Australian diggers who were captured on the Anzac Landing. And they were well treated, on the whole, by the Turks, and they couldn't understand. They always wrote about how they observed from their prison camps, which were often monasteries converted, the massacres of the Armenians, and they couldn't understand how these people who were treating them nicely were sending people on death marches through the desert. It is some of the most vivid evidence of the astonishment that Australians who saw these small mounts of the Armenian genocide were bewildered by it. At the end of the war, there was a very extensive inquiry conducted by the Americans, who hadn't been active in the area. They sent under General Harbord a lot of investigators, and they reported this is the most colossal crime of all the ages, this wholesale attempt on a race. Well, that is genocide in my book, and it was certainly genocide in the view of Raphael Lemkin, the brilliant Polish lawyer who invented the word genocide and who argued throughout the 20s and 30s that there wasn't any international criminal law at the time, that international law had to develop to punish people who perpetrated murder on racial or religious grounds. The British had actually tried. They'd taken 68 of the top Turkish officials to Malta to try them, and then their lawyers said, but we can't. They acted according to the law at the time in Ottoman Turkey, and we can't punish. International law doesn't allow us to punish them for obeying orders in their own country. So they had to be released. The court had no jurisdiction to try them. There was no such thing as international criminal law. There wasn't until Nuremberg. So one thing did happen, though. Talat Pasha, the prime mover in the genocide, he and his colleagues were rescued by Germany, and Germany refused after the war to extradite him. So he was living happily in Berlin. And a vigilante, Armenian, who had lost all his family on the death marches, killed him and was tried for murder. And as in his defense, he called a number of German generals, as well as German missionaries, who told the jury the truth about the Armenian massacres and deportations, and the jury acquitted him. Well, Lemkin thought that was wrong. You can't live on the justice of the vigilante. This was a particular, it came to him, the idea of genocide. He studied all the genocides in history since the time of Carthage, which was destroyed, as you remember. And he felt that there should be an international law that required states in the world to punish this peculiar, particular, and particularly dangerous crime. And so he campaigned throughout the 30s, always using the Armenian genocide, or the Armenian killings, as his example of genocide. And of course, there became, throughout as the 30s progressed, another example, the Holocaust, even more hideous. After the war, embassies were receptive to the idea. But Lemkin lobbied them, but he was it was a pain in the neck because he was obsessed by it. And the Canadian embassy in Geneva, which had to put up with him, the ambassador said, "I've got a great idea. Let's get rid of him. Let's send him to that Australian, Dr. Evatt, who's much the same. He's a pain in the neck as well." So they sent Lemkin to Evatt. Well, it was a marriage made in heaven. They got on like houses on fire. And it was part of the doc's genius, I guess he was. The two were both legal geniuses, and they realized that it was so important that genocide throughout history, the working people up to a form of nationalism that makes them feel superior, that makes them despise race that they would otherwise feel in awe of because they were money-making or clever or whatever. They went through the whole, and they realized that the Nazi plan was, in fact, the most recent and perhaps the worst example. So they devised the Genocide Convention, and Evatt was actually the president of the General Assembly who introduced the Genocide Convention to it. So the Genocide Convention itself was fashioned by the Armenian experience, which was not, as Julie Bishop said in that wretched letter, it was not a tragedy. This is what countries say, even Turkey says. It was a tragedy. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a crime, and it was the most heinous crime of all. And the Genocide Convention is still very important, more important than ever now that 146 countries have ratified it, including the United States, which is very reluctant to ratify any convention. It was ratified by Ronald Reagan after he visited Bitburg Cemetery, in which there were SS graves. And there's a wonderful story about this, which I minded to. There was a young, fat, bearded protester in Flint, Michigan, who heard of this, who heard there were SS graves, and he flew over with a friend, and they held out these banners as Reagan was visiting the cemetery. SS Reagan honors SS killers. And this, of course, hit America. The banners were in all the newspapers. The Jewish lobby became apoplectic. And in order to pacify them, 3 weeks later, Reagan, to everyone's surprise, decided to ratify the Genocide Convention. And the young, obese, bearded protester making his first and perhaps greatest contribution to the history of protest was Michael Moore. So it's important to understand that, because there's a lot of misinformation around, genocide doesn't mean you kill the whole race, only part. It's sufficient. Srebrenica was genocide with 7,000 Muslims killed and 18,000 deported. Nor does it include directly killing or injuring. Section 2 of the Genocide Convention says that genocide is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part. And that's the death march, isn't it? That is exactly what was done by the Ottoman Turks to hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million, perhaps more Armenians, deliberately inflicting on them conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction by forcing them to march hundreds of miles through a burning desert without food, with typhus in the concentration camps at the end, with typhus running wild. So there can be no doubt that what happened to the Armenians in 1915 was genocide. It's true, as I say, that no court has had the opportunity to hold that it was, but the evidence is, I believe, overwhelming, and the law is clear. and whether 600,000 died out of 1.1 million, or whether 1,500,000 died out of 2.1 million, the fact is that the genocide is proven, and that, well, how does Turkey defend it? Well, it says, yes, there were massacres, but they were caused by a few, I quote, unruly officials. Unruly is another one of these genocide euphemisms, unruly officials, which is a new euphemism for barbaric officials implementing barbaric policies. And then they say military necessity caused the relocation. Well, you've got to accept that in war it may sometimes be necessary to have members of a population that you've discriminated against for hundreds of years to be watched, to be surveyed, have their leaders sometimes held in prison to intern, perhaps. America has apologized to the Japanese for interning some of them during the Second World War. But you can't ever justify genocide, or you can't justify putting them on death marches, civilians, women and children and old men on death marches. You could, if someone was dangerous, you could intern them, but not kill them in the way the Armenians were killed. But this argument that it was due to military necessity is being promoted by a massive PR exercise in the run-up to the centenary, and it's very dangerous. Deliberate killing of civilians can never be justified in order to gain military advantage. There were some dangers on the Russian front. There were some Armenians who defected to the Russian army. There were outbreaks of violence from Armenians in the townships, but only one town, the town of Van, did they ever succeed in overthrowing Turkish army, and then only for 2 months. So the danger of giving legal credence to the Turkish argument is that it applies to all genocides where there is civil resistance. You see, the Turks say, the Jews never fought back, so the Holocaust couldn't be justified. But we had these Armenians who were potential or actual fifth columnists, the enemy within. But if you say that you can get away with genocide if you've got a terrorist group or a civil resistance group, well, that justifies Rajka Paska in Sri Lanka killing 70,000 civilians in order to exterminate the Tamil Tigers. It justifies the Pakistan army killing perhaps up to 3 million Bengalis in 1971 because they harbored some freedom fighters. It is during war, in fact, during civil war, that the law of genocide is most necessary to protect minority groups. And it is ironic that the Turkish government denies the genocide of the Armenians on the pretext that they were the enemy within during a war, the very circumstances of which put special obligations on a state to protect racial and religious group. And this is why genocide trials continue today in The Hague for the perpetrators of Srebrenica, the Bosnian Serb generals. 4 of them have already been convicted, and General Mladic is on the way to being convicted. This is significant because it's the last cases of genocide. Srebrenica was a Muslim enclave in the Serb-populated countryside. Mladic came to town, captured it, ordered the deportation of all Muslim women, the old men and the very young boys. And actually, no, he kept the boys, unless it's over 5, were kept with the able-bodied men. There were 7,000 able-bodied men and boys that he separated. The rest were deported, and then they were detained, carted off, killed, and buried in mass graves, which later, of course, were opened up and yielded the corpses, hands tied behind their back, shot from behind. It was, you may remember, that incriminating evidence that had come from a private camcorder with the grainy images of Muslim men and boys huddled in the fields, surrounded by soldiers who waited impatiently to be blessed by Orthodox priests so they could with easy consciences shoot their prisoners before nightfall. And this went to the International Court of Justice, which ruled, and I quote, "The Bosnian Serb forces not only knew that the combination of the killings of the men with the forcible transfers of the women, children, and elderly would inevitably result in the physical disappearance of the Bosnian Muslim population of Srebrenica, but clearly intended through those acts to physically destroy this group." And that is what the Ottoman leaders clearly intended to do to the Armenians in Anatolia in 1915. So what are we to make of this massively funded Turkish government denialism of any crime committed by their predecessors? It goes beyond denialism. Under Section 301 of the Turkish Criminal Code, citizens are prosecuted for asserting that there was a genocide. Hrant Dink, the courageous newspaper editor, was actually prosecuted, and then when he got out of prison, he was assassinated, and the government has still done nothing to bring his assassins to justice. School children are taught to write essays refuting the genocide. The press restrictions in Turkey is now 154th, I think, in the world in press freedom tables, largely because of its ban on criticism of the Ottoman behavior. It was a long time ago, but 100 years is still within living memory. Several very old Armenian women took tea with President Obama last year, together with the world's most famous Armenian, Kim Kardashian. And of course, the mental scars, the psychological trauma on children and grandchildren continue throughout the diaspora and will continue until Turkey makes some acknowledgement of the crime and some reparation. And I think international law may provide some assistance, as it has with Nazi loot. There are assets that were expropriated in 1915 that can still be traced. Over 1,000 churches were taken and seized. They can be given back. In fact, there was a move to this a couple of years ago. A church at Lake Van was restored and returned to the Armenians, and that gives perhaps hope of what can happen. Armenians want their historic lands restored. I think that's probably asking too much, although I have suggested that the majestic, magical mountain, Mount Ararat, of Noah's Ark fame, that overlooks the capital, Yerevan, but is still in Turkish hands, could be restored as an act of reconciliation. But what they most want, of course, is acknowledgement of the crime that was committed against their race. And if Turkey chokes on the admission of genocide, at least it must admit, because no one can deny, that its Ottoman predecessor committed a crime against humanity. There can be no legal argument about that. But Turkey outrageously claims that if the 1915 events did not amount to genocide, they amounted to nothing at all. It was the war. Military necessity can justify the marching of hundreds of thousands of civilians to their death. Well, that this is a war crime of utmost gravity was confirmed by the American and Australian military courts, which convicted Japanese generals for the death marches in the Philippines and at Samarkand. Their victims were soldiers who were prisoners of war, to subject civilians to the same treatment is a crime that military necessity can never justify, any more than it could justify General Mladek's destruction of Muslims in Srebrenica on the ground of strategic advantage for his army and his cause. Genocide, because it's the worst crime against humanity, calls for special study of its causes, special precautions against its recurrence. There are lessons to be learned from the way in which a new and seemingly progressive Young Turk government decided to solidify its support behind the banner of racial superiority, and how this in turn led its intellectual theorists to dehumanize and demonize minorities from other races. Genocide scholarship serves a valuable purpose of identifying patterns that recur in the build-up to behavior in which formerly happy neighbors can be incited to hack each other to death and to renounce the very notion of neighborhood as a living space which human beings of different creeds or colors can amicably occupy. Within living memory, murderous race hatred has been inflicted on the Hindus and Bengalis in Bangladesh, on the Tutsis in Rwanda, the Muslims of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Tamils of Sri Lanka, the Chechens in Russia, the Mayans in Guatemala, the Chinese in Indonesia, the Darfurians in Sudan, and other victim groups. The list is long, and it will lengthen unless the world now remembers the Armenians and rejects the claim that their killing was no more than military, cruel necessity.
Thank you, Geoffrey, for that most interesting and I guess concerning speech, and one which has many resonances. I'm sure we're all thinking at the moment about what's going on in the Middle East and seeing the similarities, the talk of caliphates and beheadings and these kinds of things. So we will start with, I'll kick off with a question and then we'll go to some of our other reporters here. But are we seeing a genocide occurring in Iraq and Syria at the moment? And I guess allied to that question, the government, of course, is pushing new powers through, new laws through the parliament to
convict journalists.
Yes, to convict journalists in some cases, or at least potentially. But also it has some foreign fighters legislation about to go through the parliament, which will make specific crimes in relation to foreign fighters returning. You've commented on this before, so allied to the question about whether we have potentially a genocide going on there, does the body of law that we have at the moment, the Crimes Act and so forth, cater for people returning, or do we need these new powers in the code?
Okay, quick answers to what I think are three questions there. Firstly, there is evidence that ISIS is a genocidal, has a genocidal intention. Certainly, it's committing war crimes. One of the oldest war crimes in history, going right back to before the Civil War in Britain, is that the rule against executing your captured prisoners, prisoners of war. We see them on the films that they take themselves, executing, bang, 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 into the river, those fighters whom they've captured. They're prisoners of war. That's a war crime, a serious war crime. We believe that they have executed Christian communities who refuse to renounce Christianity and to take their particular brand of primitive extremism. They've also killed Shia communities. They've killed even moderate Sunni communities and a number of other obscure sects who, in towns that they've overrun. So that is certainly on the Srebrenica principle. That does amount to genocide, certainly crime against humanity. And this was one of the arguments that I put in Britain, where there was some question. British forces were invited into Iraq, but not into Syria, although Syria didn't complain because they too were fighting ISIS. But on the basis that ISIS is perpetrating genocide, then that justifies and indeed requires, under Doc Evertt's Genocide Convention, the intervention. The question of the Freedom Fighters Bill, I don't know, Gough Whitlam's death has ended question time.
Yes, it has. It's foreign fighters, yeah.
But we may later in the week come into the Foreign Fighters Bill. I've had a quick look at it. I think that there are dangers to investigative journalism. We've seen in Britain recently that these very wide police powers and intelligence agency powers can be wretchedly abused. And it has been the media, particularly The Guardian, but also other newspapers, that have exposed, for example, the licensing of policemen to not just infiltrate protest organizations, but to have sex with protesters. And there are a number of children that have now been traced to Scotland Yard, and it was facing child maintenance proceedings and others. This is the kind of abuse that goes on when you have these secret organizations. Now, one danger of the Foreign Fighter Bill is that it throws a veil of secrecy over ASIO and federal police activity without any kind of public interest defense. I think journalists can go to prison for up to 10 years for reporting, even where there is the strongest of public interest. So the example of, that we've seen in other countries, of relying on the media to expose, and we've seen, I think, the overwrought and overbroad actions of ASIO in bugging the wife of the last Indonesian president's telephone and so forth, with no military, no strategic necessity. And again, revealed by the whistleblower Snowden. I think the media does need to be protected by a public interest defense. It's not in the Act.
Thank you very much.
Finally, I think you asked the question of what to do about the foreign fighters who are returning home. This was a debate we had in Britain. The Prime Minister initially said, let's keep them out. We can't, let's pass a law to keep them out. Wait a minute. Some of his party said we can't make them stateless. Isn't it better, rather than foisting them on other countries or having them try to get in surreptitiously, if we actually put them on trial? And like Australia, Britain has those laws against war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And the thinking now is that in Britain that these people, instead of being rendered stateless, which is contrary to international law, they should actually be put on trial. The prison sentences are long, but it might act as a deterrent to others. And there is hope that if they want a shorter sentence, they would be prepared to participate in programs that have been set up with psychiatrists, social workers and imams to try to persuade other young potential jihadis not to join the jihad. So I think we have those laws rather than turning Australians away and letting some other country deal with them. We should arrest them and put them on trial.
Thank you very much. Next question from Michael Brissenden.
Michael Brissenden from ABC. I note that a lot of the material that you spoke about, the POW stuff that's at the War Memorial, a lot of that's not on display and has never been displayed. Also in the Parliament, a number of MPs over the years have raised the idea of making some sort of parliamentary declaration about the Armenian genocide. Joe Hockey in particular, who is
Who is
half
partly Armenian, I think.
In the last year or so, that's fallen off completely. There's been no discussion of that. Well, I think we all know why. But do you think that'll change after the 25th of April next year? And have you been in any discussions with anybody? Have you been given any indication that it might?
Well, I believe that the reason for the Australian government writing that unhappy letter was that they, contrary to Tony Abbott and others' statements in previous years, that there was a desire not to upset Turkey and not to be excluded from Turkey. But there is no doubt that the issue will continue. One hopes that Turkey will make some form of apology on and will make some offer of reparation, whether it's giving up Mount Ararat or not, I don't know. But that is the hope. It may still happen. If it doesn't, then I think there will be a move for Australian Parliament federally. The South Australian Parliament and New South Wales Parliament have acknowledged the genocide. I think the Australian Parliament should do so because it is the historical truth. And why should we shrink from a historical truth that our own soldiers wrote about in their letters home? And why should we not give some solace to those 50,000, I think, Armenians who live in Australia, to give them the surety and the certainty that they live in a country where their sufferings are understood.
Next question from Peter Phillips.
Jeffrey Robertson, welcome to the Press Club. It's great to have you here. Thank you for your address. I visited Turkey for about 10 days, only very recently, and just in the lead up to the recent presidential election. And while one encountered constantly in dialogue and with the Turks across a whole range of occupations and areas, strong support and an acceptance of the inevitability of the return of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, nonetheless, one encountered significant numbers of younger, secular, internationalist Turks who were ready to question orthodoxies and were ready to challenge some of the things which they saw that their government was about and was likely to continue to be about. Against that background, I wonder, in your research, do you encounter any of those people? Have you found any of those people in Turkey who are ready to question the orthodoxy and the party line on the Armenian?
Massively. I mean, it is one of the great things about the younger generation throughout the world at the moment, that they are determined. There have been a lot of protests in Turkey. Turkey has massive censorship. A couple of years ago, it started when they discovered there was some clip on the internet that suggested Ataturk was gay. And so they closed down the internet for 3 weeks. And then more recently, there have been allegations of corruption made against Erdogan himself and his ministers, and that has led to closure of YouTube sites and so forth. And that is why, and then there was some protests at Gezi Park, and they were rather brutally put down. And so there is a great deal of discussion and debate. Part of it, of course, has been inspired by the killing of Hrant Dink, who is seen as a great figure to a lot of young people in the universities. So it's not as though all Turks believe that the genocide is an international lie. It is the nationalist parties in Turkey that promote that, and we can only hope that sense will prevail, and that Turkey, which is an extraordinarily important nation and in many ways a vital nation in NATO, because it's there as the bridge to the Middle East, will actually close down this particular problem which prevents it from becoming, for example, a member of the European Union.